Welcome to the deep dive. Ever felt like trying to understand a big government bill is like tackling a giant puzzle? One with thousands of pieces, and maybe the picture on the box keeps changing slightly.
Yeah, that's a pretty good analogy, actually, especially for something like this.
Exactly. Today, we're diving into one of those puzzles, a huge government plan people call the One Big Beautiful Bill, or the BBB. Its official name is HR1.
It really is a massive piece of legislation. It aims to change quite a lot about how the government works, how it spends money.
And our mission for this deep dive is to really cut through all that complexity. We're going to focus specifically on Title III of the bill.
Right. That's the section put together by the Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs.
Our goal, for you listening, is to help you get a really quick but solid handle on the biggest changes proposed in Title III.
We want you to understand what they're proposing, sure, but also, who it affects, why lawmakers are for or against it.
And what the bigger picture is for government spending, national security, even things like housing for families across the country.
Think of this as your focused study session, like getting the inside track to being really well informed on this specific part.
We'll hit 5 main areas Title III touches. That financial watchdog, the CFPB.
Some green housing funds, the SEC, that's the market referee.
National security money, and affordable housing programs, too.
So as we go, we really encourage you to think critically. Think about how government priorities shift and what those shifts actually mean.
Okay, let's start unpacking this thing. So first off, this One Big Beautiful Bill, the BBB, it's more than just a name, right? It seems to represent a pretty big shift.
Oh, absolutely. At its heart is this comprehensive government plan presented explicitly as President Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill.
Right.
You can kind of think of it as a big blueprint for how the government plans to manage its money, where resources should go, what its scope should be.
And the goals are pretty broad.
Very ambitious. Things like making certain tax cuts permanent, boosting border security, significantly increasing military funding, reforming big programs like Medicaid, and also cutting overall government spending.
So it's basically a huge money shuffle, changing where the federal dollars flow, not just tweaking things, but really reprioritizing.
Exactly. It's a very clear, deliberate shift in fiscal strategy, sending big money towards these specific priorities.
And within that massive bill, we find Title III.
Yes. Title III is a specific section, and it comes from the Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. Senator Tim Scott, a Republican, chairs that committee, and he's been a key figure in shaping these provisions.
And he's been pretty clear about what Title III is trying to achieve, hasn't he? Framing it as tackling government spending.
He has. Senator Scott consistently says the main goals are things like cutting waste and duplication, saving hardworking taxpayer dollars, streamlining the federal bureaucracy.
Well, it sounds like fiscal conservatism.
Pretty much. And ultimately, putting our federal government on a more sustainable fiscal path. So the practical target for Title III is specific. Reduce the deficit by at least $1 billion over 10 years.
Okay, $1 billion over 10 years, so 2025 to 2034.
That's the time frame, yeah. It's a focused effort within the larger bill, really pushing those ideas of fiscal discipline and government efficiency.
So as we get into the specifics, we really want you, our listener, to think like an insightful analyst here. Don't just hear the facts.
Right. Think about the changes themselves, weigh the arguments for and against them, and really consider what the real-world effects might be. Connect the dots.
Okay, first up, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB. To really get the debate around it, we need to understand what it actually does. It plays a pretty big role for regular people, right?
Oh, definitely. The CFPB is essentially a financial watchdog. Its main job is to make sure banks, credit card companies, lenders, all those financial players, play fair, that they aren't trying to cheat or deceive American families.
Like a referee for your money dealings, making sure you don't get tricked.
That's a good way to put it. It tries to ensure transparency and stop unfair practices.
So given how important that sounds, how does it get its funding? Because that seems to be the heart of this debate.
It really is central. See, unlike most federal agencies that have to ask Congress for money every year in the appropriations process.
Right, the budget battles.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The CFPB gets its funding directly from the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
The Fed, the country's central bank.
Okay, so it bypasses the usual congressional budget process. That sounds like a big difference.
It's a huge difference. The CFPB can draw money from the Fed up to a certain limit, a cap.
What's the cap now?
Currently, it's 12% of what the Fed's operating expenses were back in 2009, adjusted for inflation each year.
12%. And why was it set up that way? Why the independence?
It was designed that way on purpose
Yeah.
to give the CFPB independence.
Yeah.
The idea was if it doesn't have to ask Congress for money every year, it can focus on protecting consumers without worrying so much about political pressure or, having its budget slashed if it takes an action some powerful group doesn't like.
Makes sense. It can just focus on the mission.
That was the intent, yeah. Less vulnerability to political winds.
Okay, so that's the current setup. What does Title III propose to change?
Title III proposes a really big change. It wants to cut that funding cap drastically.
How much?
Down from the current 12% to 6.5%.
Wow, nearly cut in half.
Pretty much. And it's worth remembering, earlier ideas floated were even more severe, 0% or 5%. So 6.5% is less extreme than that, but still a major reduction from where it is now.
And if that cut happens, what's the practical effect on how the CFPB works?
Well, it would almost certainly mean the CFPB would have to go through that annual appropriations process with Congress.
Ah, so it loses that independence.
That's the core implication.
Yeah.
It would have to justify its budget to Congress every single year, making it much more dependent on lawmakers and, potentially, much more subject to political influence over its priorities and actions.
A fundamental shift from how it was designed.
Definitely. From pretty autonomous to highly dependent.
Okay, let's get into the why. Why are proponents like Senator Tim Scott pushing for these cuts? What's their main argument?
Their case is built on fiscal responsibility and government efficiency. They frame these cuts as necessary steps to, again, cut waste and duplication in our federal government.
Saving taxpayer money.
Exactly. Saving hardworking taxpayer dollars. The bigger goal, they say, is putting the government on a more sustainable fiscal path, more disciplined spending.
And do they think the CFPB can still do its job with less money?
Yes. Senator Scott has said specifically that even with reduced funding, the CFPB could still perform its statutory functions, the jobs Congress legally requires it to do.
Okay.
Plus, a big part of their argument is about stopping what they call agency overreach.
What do they mean by that? Like specific examples?
They point to things like the CFPB's efforts to limit bank overdraft fees.
Yeah.
They argue that's like the government trying to price fix services.
And they think that hurts people.
Their argument is it could actually hurt consumers by limiting access to certain services. So for them, cutting funding is a way to rein in what they see as the CFPB going too far, interfering too much in the market.
Okay, that's one side clearly laid out. Now, the opposition. Why are Democrats, Senator Elizabeth Warren is a key voice here expressing such grave concerns?
They are deeply concerned. Senator Warren and others argue that such a big cut would inevitably make it easier for bad actors to cheat American families.
How so?
By weakening the CFPB's ability to actually do its job to protect people from unfair, deceptive financial practices. They see the funding cut as directly harming consumer protection.
And it also hits that independence issue we talked about.
Absolutely. They argue forcing it into the annual appropriations fight would severely weaken its crucial independence, making it vulnerable to industry pressure. Senator Warren has pointed out that a big cut could stop the CFPB from doing more than 80 important jobs Congress gave it. And she often brings up the fact that the CFPB has returned over $21 billion to Americans who were ripped off.
$21 billion, that's a significant number.
It is. They use that figure to highlight what they see as the agency's effectiveness and why its resources are vital.
Now, this whole thing gets tangled up in Senate rules too, right? Something called the Byrd Rule. Can you break that down?
Yes. This is where it gets into the weeds of Senate procedure, but it's really important. The one big, beautiful bill is being moved using budget reconciliation.
Okay, what's that?
It's basically a fast-track process for bills dealing with spending, revenue, the debt limit. It lets a bill pass the Senate with just a simple majority, avoiding the usual 60-vote filibuster hurdle.
Sounds useful for getting things passed.
It is, but there are strict rules. The Byrd Rule is the main one. It says reconciliation bills can only include things that directly affect the federal budget. No extraneous policy changes allowed.
So it has to be about the money, not just changing policy for policy's sake.
Exactly, and there's an official referee for these rules.
The Senate parliamentarian.
Right, Elizabeth McDonough. She actually ruled against earlier, even deeper cuts to the CFPB funding in a previous attempt.
Aye.
Her reasoning was that those very deep cuts looked more like major policy changes rather than just budgetary ones, so they violated the Byrd Rule. It was basically a warning shot.
But Senator Scott is still trying.
Yes, he said he'll continue working with the Senate parliamentarian to find a way to limit the funding that does comply with the rules. So This procedural fight is definitely not over. It shows how much these outcomes depend not just on what people want, but on the complex rules of the game.
Fascinating. So for you listening, really chew on this. What's the right balance here? Government efficiency, saving money, versus making sure consumers are protected from financial tricks. There are strong arguments on both sides. All right, let's shift gears from financial regulation to housing. Title III seems to have a kind of push-pull effect here, some cuts, but also some new investments. Let's start with the cuts, specifically these green and resilient housing funds. What was that program about?
This was a program set up to help apartment buildings get upgraded. Two main goals. Make them more resilient, meaning stronger against extreme weather like hurricanes or floods.
Okay.
And make them green, more energy efficient, better for the environment. The money originally came from the Inflation Reduction Act.
And Title III wants to rescind this money. What does rescind mean here?
It means to take back or cancel funding that's been allocated but hasn't actually been spent yet. So the money set aside for these green and resilient upgrades would essentially be pulled back, stopping those projects.
Okay, so the upgrades don't happen. Why do proponents like Senator Scott want to do this? Same reasons as before.
Pretty much the same rationale, yes. It's framed as cutting waste and duplication in our federal government and saving hardworking taxpayer dollars. Again, the goal is contributing to that more sustainable fiscal path. They see these unspent funds as something that can be cut to save money.
Now, you mentioned something interesting here, what the sources don't say. They talk about saving money, but not the impact of not doing these upgrades.
That's a really key observation for anyone analyzing this. The sources explain the why, from a fiscal perspective, saving money. But they don't really detail the potential consequences of not making those buildings more resilient or energy efficient.
Like, will buildings be less safe in storms? Will energy bills go up?
Exactly. The sources don't spell that out. Will older housing be more vulnerable? Will residents face higher energy costs? It leaves this gap, this area of unexplained consequences. You could certainly infer that it might slow down efforts to modernize buildings, especially in vulnerable areas, or maybe shift those costs onto owners or renters. And, it's worth noting, this move goes against typical Democratic priorities, as they usually support these kinds of climate adaptation and energy efficiency programs.
Okay, so that's the cut. But you mentioned silver linings elsewhere in housing within this bill. What are those?
Right. Despite that cut, other parts of the bill are presented as positive steps for housing and community development. The biggest one is a planned expansion of the low-income housing tax credit, or LIHTC.
LIHTC, I've heard of that. It's a pretty big deal in affordable housing, isn't it?
It's huge. It's the largest federal program we have that encourages private companies to invest in building or fixing up affordable rental homes for families with low or moderate incomes.
And this bill proposes expanding it.
Significantly. The plan is actually for the largest expansion of LIHTC in over 25 years.
Wow. What could that mean in terms of actual homes?
Housing experts estimate this expansion could help create an extra 527,000 affordable rental homes across the U.S. over the next 10 years.
500,000 homes. That's substantial.
It really is. A major potential boost to affordable housing supply.
Would certain areas benefit more?
It seems designed to particularly help states where lots of renters are already struggling, paying a huge chunk of their income for rent. And there's also something called a basis boost, included specifically for projects in rural and tribal areas.
Basis boost. What's that do?
It basically makes the tax credits more valuable for developers building in those areas. It makes it more financially attractive to build affordable housing in places that are often harder to develop in, like rural communities or tribal lands.
Okay, LAHTC expansion. What else is considered a silver lining?
The other main piece is the renewal of opportunity zones, or OZs.
Right, opportunity zones. Remind us what those are.
They're designed to encourage investment in economically distressed communities. The idea is, by offering tax benefits to investors, you can spur new businesses, create jobs, and build housing in struggling areas.
And the bill renews this program.
Yes, it renews and extends it, and this is important, with stricter rules.
Stricter how? What's the goal of the new rules?
The goal seems to be better targeting. The new rules say investments must go into areas of deeper distress and rural communities.
So no more investing in areas just next door to struggling areas if they aren't struggling themselves.
Exactly. That loophole, or flexibility depending on your view, is being closed. The focus is sharpened on the most distressed places. Plus, there are bonuses for rural investments and, crucially, new reporting requirements to make the whole thing more transparent.
Transparency, so we can see if it's actually working.
That's the idea. Better tracking of where the money goes and what impact it's having on jobs, businesses, housing, in those specific zones.
So stepping back and looking at all the housing stuff in Title III, the cuts and the investments, what's the big picture strategy here? It feels like a definite shift.
It really does signal a strategic shift. They're moving away from direct federal grants for fixing up existing buildings, like that green program, and leaning much more heavily towards encouraging new affordable housing and community growth, mainly by using tax incentives to get private companies involved.
So it's framed as balancing things.
Right. Balancing fiscal responsibility, saving government money with cuts, while still trying to tackle the need for affordable housing and revitalizing communities, but doing it more through private investment spurred by tax breaks. It reflects a different philosophy on government's role.
Interesting. So here's something for you to ponder. What are the pros and cons of using tax incentives versus direct government grants when you're trying to solve big problems like affordable housing or making buildings greener? It gets to the heart of how government tries to make change happen. All right, let's move on. Title III also touches the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, and national security funding. Let's start with the SEC. What exactly is the SEC, and what's the proposal for its reserve fund?
So the SEC, that's the main watchdog for our financial markets. Think Wall Street. Its job is to protect investors, make sure markets are fair and orderly, and help companies raise capital.
The market referee.
Good way to put it. Now, Title III proposes taking back any unused money from a specific SEC fund that was meant for technology modernization, and not just taking the money back, but eliminating the fund entirely.
Getting rid of a tech fund for the market referee.
That's the proposal. Any money left in it goes to the U.S. Treasury by October 1st, 2025, and the fund is gone.
Why eliminate it? What's the justification?
Again, it echoes those themes we've heard. Proponents, like Senator Scott, call it cutting waste and duplication, saving taxpayer dollars. They label it an unnecessary reserve fund. The focus is on trimming the budget, contributing to that more sustainable fiscal path.
Does taking away tech money make the SEC, I don't know, slower? Less able to keep up with fast-moving markets or hold firms accountable? Do the sources mention that risk?
It's important to be precise here. The sources we have don't directly say that eliminating this specific fund would make the SEC less agile or hurt its ability to police Wall Street. The justification presented is purely about the financial savings.
Okay.
However, the bill does make a point of ensuring the SEC's whistleblower fund stays available.
Ah, the fund that pays people for reporting fraud.
Exactly. That fund is explicitly protected. So they're drawing a distinction. This tech fund is seen as unnecessary, but the whistleblower program is essential and remains funded.
That's a key distinction. Now, contrasting sharply with that cut, Title III proposes a big increase for something called the Defense Production Act, the DPA. What is the DPA, and how much money are we talking?
The DPA is a pretty powerful law. It lets the government basically require businesses to prioritize government contracts for goods and services needed for national defense, especially in emergencies. Think ensuring we can produce critical military supplies, or even things like medical supplies during a pandemic.
A tool for national security production.
Exactly. And Title III puts a significant chunk of new money into it, $1 billion. And that money is available until September 30th, 2027.
$1 billion. That's a clear priority. Why is this seen as so important by lawmakers like Scott, former President Trump, Senator Graham?
It's definitely positioned as a major strategic priority. The sources call it a priority of President Trump and an important tool to protect our national security. Senator Scott explicitly said it will bolster our national security. And Senator Lindsey Graham put it in a broader context. He mentioned this is part of a larger plan within the BBB to inject a much-needed $150 billion into our military to keep our nation safe.
So the DPA funding is one piece of a much bigger defense spending push in the overall bill.
That seems to be the case. It's a targeted investment within a wider strategy focused on military readiness and national security.
Seeing these shifts cuts elsewhere, a big boost to defense, does this signal, as some might ask, a sort of militarized approach to economic policy?
The sources we're looking at don't frame it that way directly. They don't use that specific language or detail negative economic impacts. The focus is consistently on the direct benefit to national security and the alignment with fiscal responsibility goals.
But the shift itself is clear.
Oh, absolutely. The implication of where the money is going is undeniable. Significant new funds for defense, while areas like green housing or the SEC Tech Fund see cuts. It clearly shows a strong prioritization of national security and defense within this bill's fiscal strategy. a definite choice about resource allocation.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? How decisions in one area, like the budget for a regulatory agency, connect to seemingly unrelated areas like defense spending. It's all part of the same big pot of money and priorities. Okay, let's try to pull all these threads together now. What are the big overarching themes we see emerging from Title III of this one big, beautiful bill?
Well, one theme that just keeps coming up is fiscal responsibility. That language, cutting waste and duplication, saving taxpayer dollars, it's the primary justification given for so many of the cuts we've discussed.
Right, it's presented as a core principle.
Exactly. Not just saving money, but making government leaner, more efficient, putting it on that more sustainable fiscal path. It's a definite philosophical approach.
And beyond just saving money, we saw some clear strategic shifts in how government might operate.
Definitely. Like the potential move for the CFPB towards more direct congressional oversight, which could mean less independence. And that big shift in housing policy, moving away from direct grants for green upgrades towards using tax incentives to encourage new private development of affordable housing.
And the defense priority?
And absolutely, the very strong, clear prioritization of national security funding, like with the DPA boost. That's a major strategic signal.
Now, this whole process, especially around things like the CFPB, often sounds really partisan. But were there any glimmers of bipartisanship anywhere in or around Title III? Can Republicans and Democrats actually agree on anything related to finance or housing?
You know, it's really a mixed bag. There are examples where they work together. For instance, Senator Scott, the Republican chair, actually co-sponsored a resolution with Senator Jack Reed, a Democrat, to name April as Financial Literacy Month.
Okay, financial literacy.
Yeah, and that passed with broad bipartisan support. Also, Senator Scott has actually said he wants to find common ground with Senator Elizabeth Warren on housing. He mentioned progress is possible if they stop thinking in Republican versus Democrat terms on that issue.
So cooperation can happen on some things.
It can. But then you have the other side of the coin.
Like the CFPB funding.
Exactly. That remains a point of deep, fundamental disagreement, including those procedural fights with the parliamentarian. And the opposition to cutting those green housing funds also shows a major split in priorities.
So while there might be specific areas of agreement,
The core changes in Title III, the big fiscal and regulatory shifts, they largely reflect a specific Republican agenda. And that has naturally led to significant pushback and grave concerns from Democrats about the substance and the process.
it makes you wonder, doesn't it? Why can lawmakers agree on something like financial literacy, which seems pretty straightforward, but have such intense disagreements on how government watchdogs are funded or how environmental goals are pursued? It really shows the complexity of it all.
So to wrap things up, Title III of this one big, beautiful bill really does represent some significant potential shifts. Changes in how government agencies are funded, how they operate, and where the big money priorities lie.
Yeah, driven by these stated goals of fiscal responsibility, strengthening national security, and using a specific market-oriented approach for things like housing. It's definitely a complex package with very different views on what the effects will be.
And remember, digging into these details, understanding the arguments, even noticing where the sources don't fully explain the consequences, that helps you see how these big policy choices connect to real-world outcomes.
It's about getting beyond just the headlines, right? Understanding the mechanics underneath.
Precisely. So, as you think more about these big government plans, how money gets moved around, here's a final thought to chew on. What do you think is the most important balance for the country to strike right now? Is it mainly about saving money, boosting defense, protecting consumers, building more affordable homes, and crucially, why do you lean that way?
Keep asking those questions. Stay curious. Keep digging for information on how these decisions play out in your community and across the nation. The more you understand these complex pieces, the better you can see the whole puzzle.